Hello, everybody. Welcome to Linda Seiler's workshop. I'm going to just introduce her topic. You've already heard her testimony and you've heard her bio. So Dr. Linda Seiler, which is really fun to say, she just completed her doctorate, will be presenting her workshop that will conclude with a Q&A time on her topic. At the end of the time, Linda will, all audiences will be pulled back into the main session. Just want to let you all know. Dr. Seiler is going to share the science of transformation. Politicians seek to pass conversion therapy bans based upon the premise that same-sex attractions are inborn and immutable. But is that what the latest science indicates? Dr. Seiler will share from her recently completed PhD dissertation summarizing the latest scientific research. Find out what brain scan, hormones, epigenetics, genome-wide studies, genome-wide studies, here we go, reveal about the immutability of same-sex attraction, or the lack of changeability is what immutability means, and how the latest science actually confirms what the Bible has to say about the possibility of change. So Linda, take it away.
Thank you, Anne. Appreciate it. Good to see you guys. And yeah, there was one question already. What's your PhD in? It's with the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary. It's a degree in intercultural studies, which is basically 3 disciplines together: sociology, what culture says; theology, what the Bible says; and missiology, how does that inform our mission? And so I did my dissertation addressing homosexuality as the cultural issue, and specifically, can people change? And so I looked at that through the lens of what does our culture say, what does science say, which I'm going to present some of that scientific data right now, and then what does the word say, theology, and then how does that inform our mission to those that deal with same-sex attractions? So I am going to share my screen. Okay, so there we go. I think you should be seeing, click to close message. All right, there we go. So with, let's just jump right into this since we only have a few minutes, and then Q&A. Some of you heard my own story with my testimony this morning about how the attractions and gender desires felt inborn, and it felt, somewhat cruel. How could God, if I'm born that way, how could God say that if I act on these things that feel so natural, that's a sin? And so I was really wrestling with that. And really the essence of what's going on with the science behind all of this is there's been a push for decades to try to normalize homosexual desires and transgender ideology now. And to take it out of the realm of it being a moral issue. Like I love what Dr. McDowell was sharing in the previous session and talking about how, we have to see this from the worldview. If you're not looking at a biblical worldview, then the secular worldview says, hey, you're sexless human beings and you're not male and female. You weren't designed by God. And so there's been this push to take things out of the realm of morality and out of a Christian biblical view of sexuality and into the realm of civil rights. So for example, if we can say that same-sex attractions are inborn and heritable in the same sense that your skin color, your ethnicity, those things are, then we can impose laws and civil rights in that issue, in that area, to enforce that. But the reality is, even though, while you'll find people that call themselves ex-gay, that they've experienced change in their desires, you won't find somebody who says, well, I'm an ex-African American, or somehow their ethnicity changes or their skin color or whatever. So anyway, that's what we're dealing with now, is when you take it out of the realm of morality and into the realm of civil rights, and you say you're born that way, now we have to sanction that, as we're seeing happen in our culture with same-sex marriage and so forth. So does the science really support that this is inborn, this is a civil rights issue, and it deserves protected rights in the same sense that we're created male and female in the image of God for male-female marital unions? So just to go back briefly in time and look at some of the history, there's been attempts to try to find some kind of a biological determinant for same-sex attractions for quite some time. And if you go back to the 90s and you see, sorry, I need to go to a different screen to flip my thing. So Simon LeVay came up with this brain study in 91, and he said, you know, the hypothalamus in gay men seems to be smaller than that of heterosexual men. So we think there's something in the structure of the brain that you're born with that makes you gay. And everybody went with that and said, wow, this is wonderful news. We know Newsweek published a study, you know, now we're going to know even from birth if a child is gay because there's a biological determinant. And around the same time in 1993, Dean Hamer came up with a gay gene study finding a link on the XQ28 chromosome that's passed down through the maternal line, which would explain why even though gay men don't copulate with women and reproduce their own children, the gene would be perpetuated through the X chromosome. And everyone has an X chromosome. Males are XY, females are XX, and so that gene could be perpetuated throughout the generations in that way. And then there was another study around 91 that came out. Bailey and Pillards did a twin study of identical twins, and they found that 52% of the time, when one twin is gay, the other twin is also gay. Even though it's not 100%, that's still a huge percentage. And so scientists were like, yeah, we are definitely finding biological determinants to same-sex attractions. And so the American Psychological Association posted in 1998, there's considerable recent evidence to suggest that biology, including genetic or inborn factors, play a significant role in a person's sexuality. So it's kind of like case closed, right? But the problem is with each of the three studies I just showed you, in order for them to become an official scientific theory, they have to be replicated with the same control, same variables, same outcomes. And for none of those studies did that happen. And in fact, LeVay's study has come under so much scrutiny, he personally recanted and said this: it's important to stress what I didn't find. I did not prove homosexuality is genetic or find a genetic cause for being gay. And what we discovered about Simon LeVay is he is actually a gay man himself. And he even has said publicly, I am out to prove to those religious people, you know, those prejudiced people, that this is inborn. The second study that I mentioned, Dean Hamer, we also discovered that he is a gay man. And he said, recanted his own study and said, you know, there's not a single master gene that makes people gay. I don't think we'll ever be able to predict who will be gay. It's more complicated than that, he says. And then regarding the twin study, what we discovered is when they were recruiting subjects for that study, they advertised among gay magazines. And so the likelihood that you might get two twins that are both gay reading the same magazine, it would be higher. It wasn't a completely objective pool of subjects. And in recent years, more twin studies have been done, and they've never been able to replicate the 52% concordance rate. Every time they do another twin study of a wider scale, the percentage goes down further and further. So in 2008, the APA amended their statement, and they said this: there's no consensus among scientists about the exact reasons that an individual develops a heterosexual, bisexual, gay, or lesbian orientation. Although much research has examined the possible genetic, hormonal, developmental, social, cultural influences on sexual orientation, no findings have emerged that permit scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by any particular factor or factors. Many think that nature and nurture both play complex roles. Now, the interesting thing is that the American Psychological Association actually will not fund studies that examine environmental or social factors that may contribute to same-sex attractions. It's actually become a very political organization, and they only want to publish things that examine the biological side, but not environmental side. But those studies are being done and published other places, even though the APA won't publish them. One report that came out in 2016 in the New Atlantis with Paul McHugh and Lawrence Mayer. Paul McHugh is the former psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins University Hospital, where they pioneered sex change operations. And under McHugh's tenure, he said, hey, we are discovering that when people get sex changes, they're not any better after the operation. And so there's something going on psychologically where we're not helping them by altering their body. And so it'd be better to help them mentally than to have these surgeries. And so under his tenure, they stopped sex reassignment surgeries at Johns Hopkins. McHugh is hated by gay activists, but he holds fast to the truth of what science actually says. And so he published a report in 2016 that was not able to be published in mainstream journals because of the political bias against this kind of research. But they were able to publish in the New Atlantis. And this is what there was a report. You can get this online, by the way. If you just Google the New Atlantis special report, sexuality and gender, it will come up. And you can get a free PDF online. It's very readable, actually. And it's a meta-analysis of hundreds of studies. And the conclusion of this report is that the belief that sexual orientation is an innate, biologically fixed human property, that people are born that way, is not supported by scientific evidence. So what I'm going to look at today is show you, okay, what does the most recent scientific evidence reveal? Even though our culture is just assuming you're born that way and it's just a cut and dry case, is that really what the science says? And we're going to look at three things. We'll look at genetics first, brain structure theories, and then hormonal influences. So first, when we look at genetics, I had mentioned twin studies before. The most recent twin study and largest scope to date is Langstrom et al. As far as genetics, we'll look at twin studies, genome-wide association studies, and epigenetics, and I'll explain what those are. So Langstrom et al. In 2010 did a wide scope, 2,320 different pairs of identical twins. So thousands of pairs of twins were examined, and they only found a 9.8% concordance rate. That when one twin is gay, only 9.8% of the time is the other twin also gay. That's a very low rate compared to the original rate of 52%. The authors of the study themselves said the present results support the notion that the individual specific environment does indeed influence sexual preference. So there's something going on in the environment playing a greater influence than actually genetics at the root of it all. Neil Whitehead has written a great book. He's a believer and a great guy, a research scientist, and he's got this book online you can find for free. Just Google "My Genes Made Me Do It." And in his book, he goes through all the scientific data research, and it's very well written, easily accessible. And he says this: because of the calculated low genetic fraction in twin studies, we are safe in saying that people are predominantly not born that way. In fact, it is a good example of a relative lack of prenatal programming. So really, twin studies show us the environment is playing a greater role and that genes are not playing into it at all, or at least only a 9.8%, if at all. Genome-wide studies, a genome-wide association study is where you can look at millions of genes all at once and try to find, is there a certain connection between some genes playing into a particular trait. So for example, we're looking for a cluster of genes that might, if you have this particular combination, you will for sure have same-sex attractions. In a 2012 study with 23andMe, the DNA organization, they had a database of 23,000 people that they were examining and looking, and they had the capacity. We're looking at millions of genes, and we're trying to find any kind of correlation between genes and same-sex attractions. And this is what they found. No gene linkage of statistical significance for male or female homosexual identity, including no linkage for the chromosome XQ28, which had already been debunked with Dean Hamer. A 2019 study produced similar results. So in 2019, Science Magazine produced this study of nearly 500,000 UK residents, and it's a genome-wide association study looking for some kind of combination there, correlation. And the authors were from noted places like Harvard and MIT. And this is what they concluded. There is certainly no single genetic determinant, sometimes referred to as a gay gene in the media. Many uncertainties remain to be explored, including how sociocultural influences on sexual preference might interact with genetic influences. So everything right now in gene studies are pointing towards sociocultural influences, environmental influences, not a hardwired gene that you're necessarily born with that pre-programs you to have same-sex attractions. Another area of study is epigenetics. And with epigenetics, that is the study of saying what is the influence of the environment on genes, and perhaps if there is a gay gene, if the environment operates on this gene, let's say we'll take two twins, one twin is gay, one twin isn't. And if there's a gay gene and this twin is in this environment and some environmental factor happens, it turns on the gene and it manifests, but this one doesn't have that environmental exposure, and so it won't manifest here, and that could explain why one twin is gay and the other twin is not, because they are lacking the environmental access of activating that gene. The problem with that is they haven't yet discovered a gay gene that would explain the epigenetic hypothesis, and so epigenetics don't hold up under scrutiny. So Bailey et al. In 2016 said this: our best evidence of the magnitude of genetic effects is moderate, certainly not overwhelming. In contrast to the evidence for environmental influence is unequivocal, given that identical twin concordances tend to be far less than 100%. So again, environmental influences seem to be what science is pointing to right now. A psychology professor, Lisa Diamond, who is herself a lesbian, a self-professed lesbian, and she's urging researchers to abandon the idea that sexual orientation remains immutable. She says this: higher estimates of heritability, or inheriting a trait, have been found for a range of characteristics that are not widely considered immutable or changeable, such as being divorced, smoking, having low back pain, feeling body dissatisfaction. So in other words, what she's saying is you have a higher chance of being divorced, smoking, low back pain, body dissatisfaction than you do of any genetic correlation with same-sex attractions. And so she said, really, the connection is just not there. There doesn't seem to be genetically something that is driving those attractions. And in fact, even the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, when they're talking about the prevalence of, is there a gene for alcoholism? You've probably heard theories along those lines. And they say this: genes alone do not determine whether someone will develop alcohol use disorder. Environmental factors, as well as gene and environment interactions, account for the remainder of the risk. And so everything seems to be pointing to environment, not something that you're hardwired born with this that makes you gay, genetically speaking. So let's look next at brain structures. So with brain structures, we have this concept where Simon LeVay was arguing that there's a part of your brain that is smaller in men, gay men, than it is in heterosexual men, and it must be what pre-programs you and makes you gay. What we're discovering now, decades later, is that your brain actually changes in response to your environment. And that term is called neuroplasticity. So it's plastic, it can change. It's not like a stone, it fluctuates and it's fluid. And we discover this in a variety of things, like there's been studies done where London taxi drivers, the gray matter in their brain when they do MRIs and study their brain, they have an increased gray matter in the area of the brain that is used for navigation. And that brain area is bigger in taxi drivers than it is in bus drivers who don't use navigation, don't have to navigate for themselves, but they have a pre-planned route. And so if they're just following instructions and they don't have to think and be creative, that part of their brain isn't as big as the London taxi drivers who have to navigate their way around the city, indicating there's neuroplasticity in response to the environment and somebody's job. The same is true with comparing violinists with piano players. A violinist, the part of their brain that controls the left hand, which is used a lot playing violin, is bigger than their right hand, the brain that controls the right hand. But piano players, the part of the brain that controls both hands, is equally as big, and it doesn't show a difference like violinists because of the environment and the exposure to what they're doing when they're practicing. Even people who juggle, if they learn how to juggle, you can do an MRI and it shows changes in their brain. But if they stop practicing over a period of time, the changes in their brain will actually reverse. And so neuroplasticity is a very real thing, and it even related to sexual issues. Internet pornography addiction, we can study and see that when somebody is addicted to pornography, it changes the things in their brain. and the reward and anticipation and gratification processes. And there are chemicals that are released and brain structures that are changed as a result of that. Even brain scans of transgender people. So there's this argument out there that, you know, people who are transgender, they've got, in my case, I felt like I had a male brain in a female body. And so if you were to do an fMRI of my brain and compare it to a typical male brain, it might look more masculine than it does feminine. Does it mean I was born that way? Well, according to neuroplasticity, your brain will respond to environmental factors and change accordingly. So if I spent 32 years wanting to be a man and adjusting things in my life and internet pornography addiction and those kinds of things affecting my brain, and even just the gift sets and things that God's naturally given me, maybe to think like a leader or, you know, in logic and those kinds of things, maybe not as creative or whatever, my brain will look different accordingly. And Mayer and McHugh even said in their study, in most cases, transgender individuals have been acting and thinking for years in ways that though learned behavior and associated, that through learned behavior and associated neuroplasticity may have produced brain changes that could differentiate them from other members of their biological or natal sex. So in other words, because of the environmental factors around the fact that there's neuroplasticity, that can actually change the brain, the way you process things, and how your brain would appear on an fMRI. It doesn't mean you were born that way. It means there are environmental influences and factors that may have changed your brain in that sense. So that's genetics and brain structure theories. The leading theory today is the hormonal influence theory, that somehow in the womb you are exposed to prenatal hormonal influences that either masculinize the brain or feminize the brain. And so you can end up being born as a female, but your brain is masculinized, and so you become same-sex attracted or transgender, and vice versa for boys. And this theory is based on an age-old hypothesis from 1959 called the organizational activational hypothesis by Charles Phoenix. So in 1959, Phoenix and his colleagues were injecting female guinea pigs with testosterone and trying to see, does this change their behavior at all? And so what they discovered was once these female guinea pigs were born, they would display male sexual behavior. They would be mounting other guinea pigs like males would mount them because of this increased testosterone in their system. And so they came up with this theory that, you know what, probably what happens in the womb is there's this testosterone surge that happens in males because they have testes that release testosterone. And that surge will masculinize the brain and make the boy become a boy, and the girl who doesn't have the surge becomes a girl. And that testosterone surge will also virilize the body so that every embryo essentially starts out as a female, but under virilization with the testosterone influence, the female embryo will develop male genitalia and gonads and all of that. And so their hypothesis is this testosterone surge would affect the brain, not just the physical body. Now, part of the problem to this hypothesis is it doesn't translate to rats and to ferrets and mice because they have different structural brain differences and varied hormonal reactions. And so if it doesn't apply across species, even with animals in the animal kingdom, it's questionable as to whether it can be applied to human sexuality. In fact, Kaufman, 2009, says most identified sex differences in the brain and behavior are produced under the influence of perinatal or after-birth sex steroid signaling. In other words, it's not the testosterone in the womb that really affects the brain and behavior. It's what happens with hormones that happen after birth, is what studies are finding. And the other thing they've discovered is that rats that were raised without the presence of mothers who would lick them and groom them, those male rats would actually fail to grow up with normal sexual functioning. Even though they had a testosterone surge in the womb, if they don't have a mother that will nurture them and lick them and groom them, it affected their sexual development in rats. So that was an interesting finding that contradicts the testosterone surge as being the primary influence of sexual functioning. and development. So Neil Whitehead, who wrote that book, My Genes Made Me Do It, said this: the early prenatal, the late prenatal, and the early postnatal and pubertal, so there's 4 surges of testosterone, were not enough on their own to fully sexually program the rats. They also needed maternal presence and grooming. So again, it's not that these studies with animals are showing it's not necessarily that this testosterone surge is what's programming them. It's other environmental factors as well. But what biologists and researchers who are contending for these hormonal influence theories do is they extend the organizational activational hypothesis to intersex conditions. They extend it to humans by making the link to intersex. So as Dr. McDowell just explained, the intersex condition is biological, whereas same-sex attractions or transgender desires, it has to do more with the soul and the mind. And so with intersex conditions, again, it's somebody that's born with ambiguous genitalia, isn't clear that it's male or female in some cases. Now, it's a very small percentage. That's like 0.018% of the population has that condition, but it does happen. And so there are other conditions where, as McDowell said, nearly all of the intersex conditions are either clearly male or clearly female, although they may have, a mixture of things going on chromosomally or with their gonads and things like that. So let me explain how this kind of plays out with the intersex condition. So there's one intersex condition called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Androgens has to do with the male hormones and testosterone. So a person who has AIS does not have the ability to process testosterone or androgens. And so what happens is you have a male baby, an XY fetus that lacks these receptors, and they do have internal testes that produce androgens, but even though the androgens are in the womb environment and flowing around, and it normally would virilize the body and turn the female embryo into male, it doesn't happen when they don't have these receptors. And so they have internal testes, but externally, they actually develop into a female with female genitalia, but inside, instead of ovaries, they have testes that have never descended. And so when they're born, they look like a female, and everybody assumes they're a female. Unless they do genetic testing, they actually wouldn't know. So the hypothesis is this, that a chromosomal male will have a feminized brain and always develop a female heterosexual orientation in this situation. And it is true that those who are born with AIS, technically, genetically, they are XY. So they're a male chromosomally, but their body presents as female because they can't process the male sex hormones. And so what happens is they grow up, they look very feminine. You would never look at them and be like, I think it's a man. They look extremely feminine because they can't process any testosterone. So like even all women have a degree of testosterone and androgens in their body. So an AIS person is extremely feminine because they can't process those things. And so they typically grow up thinking they're a woman, orienting to life as a woman, and they develop attractions to men. So the hypothesis is that if this affirms that if you don't have those androgen receptors, you naturally become female, and if you're not exposed to as much testosterone as needed, it won't virilize the brain. But a study in 2011 talks about a genetic male that was born with complete AIS and was raised as a female, identified as a male, not a female, contrary to usually 100% of those with AIS identify as females and are heterosexual. That's just like pretty much 100% is what the studies show. But in this one study, there was a female that didn't identify as a female, and an XY fetus that grew up, was raised as a female, didn't identify as female. And what happened was the development of they developed a male gender identity. This is complicated language, but the development of a male gender identity in a phenotypic male, so a female that appears female, Having a complete absence of functioning androgen receptors questions the role of the androgen receptor pathway in the development of male gender identity. In other words, because this female didn't have this AIS person didn't have the ability to process testosterone, yet still ended up with a masculinized brain. This female wanted to get a sex change and actually did go on to get sex change surgery, injected testosterone, but her body wouldn't virilize like a normal female or a normal, normal person who injected testosterone. Her voice didn't change, didn't grow more hair, didn't get any of the characteristics, secondary sexual characteristics for males that are associated with testosterone because of the body's complete inability to process that testosterone. And so the mother of this child actually says what happened growing up. At age 3, she refused to wear skirts. She felt ridiculous. She only played with boy toys. She was verbally expressed that she wished to be of the other gender from age 3. So there was something going on in this child's brain that cannot be accounted for biologically by a testosterone surge because it wouldn't have any effect on this child. And yet something caused this child to want to be a male. And so the only conclusion we can draw from that is that there was something in the environment that convinced this child being a male was better than being a female. Another study along the same lines of men that were born without testes, yet they still grew up to identify as heterosexual male adults, even though in the womb they didn't have any way of getting the extra androgens and having that testosterone surge in the womb to masculinize the brain, and yet they ended up being heterosexual men. And so the study says without testes, the subjects would not have experienced that prenatal surge presumed to masculinize the brain, and the results of the study suggest environmental factors may play a greater role than hormones in gender identity and sexual orientation. Another intersex condition we have is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is where your adrenals produce too many androgens, too much testosterone. Now, for boys, this has a negligible effect on males. But for females, they grow taller, they get a deep voice, they have excessive hair, they have an enlarged clitoris, and it changes their actual physical appearance. And so you would think if they have this excess testosterone in the womb, that this would masculinize their brain and it would make these women be same-sex attracted, lesbians. However, even though there is an increased rate of lesbian among CAH women, with those women, only 91.5% are heterosexual. So not even 10% statistically end up being gay. So this would be like, okay, so they have excess testosterone, and this, according to the Phoenix hypothesis, they should end up being gay because of the excess testosterone to masculinize the brain. However, it doesn't seem to have that effect, even though it did virilize the body in certain ways. And so environmental factors can play into this, and Lisa Diamond, the self-professed lesbian herself, has commented on CAH and how the effect of perceiving yourself as a social environmental factor, perceiving yourself as less feminine can have an effect. She says this: increased same-sex sexuality could stem from social rather than hormonal factors. Specifically, with girls that have CHA and are born with masculinized genitals and undergo hormonal treatment over the course of their lives, they may be aware of their differentness from other girls and might also be consciously or unconsciously treated as more masculine by their parents. If girls consequently come to perceive themselves as less feminine than other girls, this might account for their male-type play preference in childhood and their higher rates of same-sex sexuality in adolescence and adulthood. And so rather than saying this is a hormonal thing, this is more like, okay, the way you perceive yourself as gender non-conforming might be playing into the development of those attractions rather than something biologically in the prenatal environment. And Mayer and McHugh say the same thing. They said this, that the low concordance rate for homosexual orientation in twin studies, where both fetuses share the same hormonal environment in the womb, suggests that prenatal hormone exposure does not play a major role in sexual orientation. And so Diamond and Roski conclude this. Now, these are two secular researchers who are looking at the evidence and concluding and saying arguments based on the immutability or the inability to change of sexual orientation are unscientific, given what we now know from longitudinal population-based studies of naturally occurring changes in the same-sex attraction of some individuals over time. We hope that our review of scientific findings and legal rulings regarding immutability will deal these arguments a final and fatal blow. And so their commentary here is that the whole idea that you have a sexual orientation that is inborn and unchangeable is not backed by science. In fact, Lisa Diamond says this herself. She did a lot of research on what's called sexual fluidity in both men and women and has discovered people's sexual desires can spontaneously change over time, even without trying to intervene. And she says this in a lecture at Cornell University. I feel as a community, the queers have to stop saying, please help us. We're born this way. We can't change as an argument for legal standing. I don't think we need that argument. And that argument is going to bite us in the behind. Because now we know that there's enough data out there that the other side is aware of it as much as we are aware of that. And in fact, it's her own data from her study on sexual fluidity where she concluded this. Changes in patterns of same-sex and other sex attraction is a relatively common experience among sexual minorities. Between 25 and 75% of individuals reported substantial changes in their attractions over time. And these findings concord with the results of retrospective studies looking backward, showing that gay, lesbian, and bisexual identified individuals commonly recall having undergone previous shifts in their attractions. Such findings pose a powerful corrective to the previous oversimplification of sexual orientation as a fundamentally stable and rigidly categorical phenomenon. Sexual orientation is not a static and categorical trait. Rather, same-sex sexuality shows substantial fluidity in both men and women. So in other words, the science is not saying you're born that way and can't change. The science is actually saying, you know what, those desires are subject to change. And so when you look at the fact that it's not biological predeterminants, but there are actually environmental factors that can contribute to same-sex attractions or even transgender desires. Some of those environmental factors we're running out of time, so I don't have time to get into the specifics of each of those studies, but I'll summarize them as follows. So with sexual abuse, those who have been sexually abused, and you look at the meta-analysis that Mayer and McHugh did of hundreds of studies over the years, and they came to the conclusion that, yep, the stats show that if a child has been sexually molested, they are 2 to 3 more times likely to develop a non-heterosexual orientation. And I explained yesterday how when a boy is abused and he wonders, why did they choose me? And does that mean there's something deficient about my masculinity? And why did my body respond that way? Does this mean that I'm gay? And it produces confusion and psychological trauma for that boy that can affect his psychosexual development as he grows older. Same thing for a little girl when she's abused. Most often it's a male perpetrator and she concludes, wow, men are not safe. I don't ever want to be vulnerable with a man. And so when she grows up and her sexual drives kick in, because she's got that going on psychologically, and that's traumatic because we're body, soul, and spirit, that can affect your psychosexual development. And she can decide, I don't want to be sexually vulnerable with men, and I find women more appealing in that way. Women are safe, men are not. The second thing is family dynamics. A number of studies that talk about when children do not have a same-sex parent in the home, whether it's because of divorce or abuse, or they just don't connect because of their temperament, whatever it might be, that has a traumatic effect on the child of that gender. So if a little boy grows up without his father, or a little girl grows up without her mother, that can have an effect on her development and on her same-sex attractions in the future. A third one is gender nonconformity, where somebody has typically male, a female has characteristics that are more typically male, and a male has characteristics that our culture considers more typically female. And I gave the example yesterday of an effeminate type boy that is sensitive and artistic and in touch with his emotions and not an athlete, not interested in sports, But, you know, a lot of people will call him fag and sissy and all of that. And he'll feel like there's something deficient about his masculinity. And there's not. God created him that way. God gave him that temperament, that personality temperament. And there's nothing wrong with it. But our culture does not affirm that as masculine. And likewise with girls who are maybe sporty, athletic, and want to rough and tumble, do things with the boys and not stay home and do makeup and Barbies and cook and things like that. And they can be called butch and dyke, and that can be traumatic for those girls. And they feel like maybe I don't fit in and there's something deficient, different about me, that I'm not a woman among women. And that psychologically, that trauma can impact you, body, soul, and spirit, because we're all connected. And then physiologically, there are even things that can happen. When we were talking about pornography and children being exposed to pornography, or even if they're sexually molested, your first sexual experience, really any sexual experience, releases powerful chemicals in the brain, vasopressin in men, oxytocin in women, and those are known as bonding agents. And when you have that first sexual experience, by God's design, you're meant to bond to that mate for life. But when you have a sexual experience outside of God's design, you can end up bonding to that person or that thing. If it's, you know, this is how things like bestiality and things can get started, but you can develop bonding to those things in an unnatural way because of the chemicals that are released in your brain. And so McElhaney and Bush describe it this way. These are both doctors. In their book, they say, with sexual intercourse and orgasm, the woman's brain is flooded with oxytocin, causing her to desire the same kind of contact again and again with this person she's bonded to, producing an even stronger bonding, often referred to as the monogamy molecule. Vasopressin seems to be the primary cause of men attaching to women with whom they have close and intimate physical contact. So these chemicals are released, and you will bond with the person with whom you've had that sexual experience. And so if your first sexual experience is a same-sex sexual experience, that can physiologically have impacts on you as well. So with that, I think I will conclude and stop sharing my screen, and we will move into a time of questions if people have questions. So there we go. Okay, ask questions. We've got one with 2 votes. I heard that in the study about the brain difference in homosexuals, the difference was actually a result of HIV in the participants. Is that true? Good question. I don't know how to make the question go away while I'm voting for it. Yes, there is truth to that. In the study with LeVay, with his subjects, there were some that had HIV, and that seemed to have an effect as well on their brain, but he did not do a great job. When his study came under scrutiny, he didn't have an accurate record of who was actually gay and who was heterosexual, because there were some people that were heterosexual that were HIV positive, so that would throw off the results of the study. And so his whole thing was discredited and never able to be replicated by anyone else. But yes, there was the impact of HIV in that as well. That can be an environmental factor that shrinks the brain over time, which would, again, go against the hypothesis that you have a brain structure you're born with that causes you to be gay. I already answered, what is your PhD in? Is there a way to get a copy of this teaching? Please. Yes, there is. I will send in notes. I will eventually have a book with all the details and the footnotes to all of this stuff coming out. I know some of it's kind of complicated. So some of it's from my dissertation, and we will eventually publish that. But I can try to get some notes into Restored Hope, and they can make those available. Another one, it sounds like sexual abuse in girls by men turns them away from men to lesbianism. Yet in boys, that same abuse turns them toward men because they assume they must be gay. Can you explain this? Yeah, I think some of it has to do with the way we orient to sex differently. So and again, a female abusing a male can have a similar effect, where a male goes, she coerced me, and women aren't safe. And so he comes to that conclusion. But I think part of it, now this is just my personal guess at this. I don't have data to back this up. But the way we orient to sex differently as males and females could explain the difference. So for men, usually it's the physical and then the emotional kicks in. So they are visually oriented. And for women, it's usually the emotion and then the physical kicks in later. And so this might explain why when men have a physical experience with another man and then that vasopressin is released, and it's the way they orient to sex initially is a physical experience and visually, then that kind of hardwires them in that way, not hardwires, but influences them in that way. And it's also, an emotional experience as well. They're getting affirmation from a man that they're usually longing for, connection with a man. And so that can really have a profound effect on them. However, not every little boy that is sexually abused ends up becoming gay. And likewise, every little girl that experiences sexual abuse does not end up being a lesbian. And so it's not, you can say this for sure is going to happen. We all respond differently to environmental factors. And so my sister and I grew up in the same home, and she's never struggled with the issues that I have because we're two different people who respond differently with our personality temperaments. However, I would say that our difference in sexuality could also explain how some women, and this happens more often with women than men. So like, how a woman can be married for 25 years to her husband, and then later in life, all of a sudden she decides, that's it, I'm leaving my husband for another woman. And you're like, what is going on? And usually you don't see that with men. Usually men know at a very young age they have same-sex attractions and they act on it because it's the physical thing that comes first and it's very obvious for them. For women, it's an emotional thing first. And there are a lot of women who go throughout life not knowing that my emotional needs aren't getting met. Maybe they're in a bad marriage with a husband and it's just not, meeting their needs. And then they meet this best friend, they start confiding in her, and they don't mean for it to turn sexual, but they get emotionally close. And all of a sudden that emotion kicks into the physical because we both approach sex differently. So that's my best guess as to why abuse could have that effect on guys versus girls. Next question. I heard the argument that it's immoral to try to influence someone's gender orientation, even though they were not born that way, hence the fight against conversion therapy. Do you see a new argument being formed that bases the harm on something other than trying to change something that's immutable? Maybe your next PhD can explore the sociological positives and negatives to embracing versus trying to change. I really think, before I answer this, somebody just made a comment. Lots of women who experience sexual abuse end up living a very promiscuous life when they get older. And this is true. And one of the things I discovered in my research is that women that are abused, they are victimized and they feel so out of control. And so they end up oftentimes becoming promiscuous, often even with men, even if they were abused by a man, because then it puts them in the seat of control. And so you're not going to violate me. I will become promiscuous with you and seduce you. So that might be another potential explanation. Again, I have no data to back that up. It's just, my best guess on what I'm seeing in people's experience. But this question that I was just reading, do I see any argument formed on the basis of harm that bases the harm on something other than trying to change something that's immutable? I think honestly that what we're dealing with right now in our culture is that people are, this is not just a natural issue, this is a spiritual issue. We are battling strongholds and principalities and demonic things. And so the push that we're seeing is actually not logical. I just showed you the science. I just showed you out of the mouth of a lesbian researcher herself saying, let's not say you're born that way, can't change anymore. And yet nobody's listening. And that argument is perpetuated through our media and through Hollywood and all of that. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. Why? Because we're not battling flesh and blood, because the enemy hates us and the enemy wants to destroy our gender because we're made in the image of God, male and female, and he wants to decimate our sexuality because our sexuality images the gospel. And so we're dealing with strongholds that are not logic. 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5 talks about how, the weapons we fight with are not of this world, they're spiritual for the tearing down of strongholds. And a stronghold is something, it's an argument and a pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And so here's the takeaway I get from that, is if you're going to oppose God, and God is the God of truth, and truth is logical, you can't oppose God and operate in logic at the same time. And so what we're seeing in our society right now is the logic. You look at the science and you go, wow, this sexual fluidity, like this can actually change. This regular science shows you're not hardwired born this way. Why is our culture not following that? Well, because our culture is entrapped in a stronghold, in a lie that is being fed by the enemy, and it's not logical. It can't be logical because you cannot oppose the God of truth and his ways for sexuality and operate in logic at the same time. So that's my answer to that. Is there anybody else that you have a question? I don't see any other. Oh, here. What do you think of the idea that same-sex attraction is simply a result of the fall and not due to either genetic or environmental factors? I do think there's a degree where that is true. And I think we need, it's not a canned case for everybody. Neil Whitehead says this: there's many a way to SSA. For some people, you can have an experience like mine where there were root issues and things that needed to resolve and whatever, and find freedom. For others, especially in our culture right now, it's just fun to experiment. You know, maybe I'll try the transgender thing. Maybe I'll try sleeping. I kissed a girl and I think I liked it, and I'll try that. And you have no idea that when you're opening yourself up and you're experimenting sexually with the same sex, it's not just a physical act. You're opening yourself up in the spirit realm to all sorts of things you may not even be aware of. And part of that is just the fall. Part of that is just sheer rebellion and just saying, I'm going to do my own thing instead of doing what God says. So yeah, I think it's not a formula. We're not robots. We all have different personality temperaments. We all have different backgrounds and different reasons. So yeah, I think same-sex attraction has a variety of potential origins. But the good news is the gospel applies to all of it, and there's freedom in Jesus, no matter what you struggle with. Are you still working with college students? Have you found a way to communicate all of this effectively to young people? Any insights on how to do that well? I am working with college students. I was pastoring a local campus at Purdue University, and now I'm working on the national level and internationally with the same organization to train leaders. What I've discovered with youth in this generation is that they are so hard set against absolutes, and they really bear witness with the subjective narrative. And so one of the best ways to reach this generation is to share personal stories and testimonies. You can't argue with that. You can say transgender desires are inborn and unchangeable, and I can say, well, they weren't in my case. Let me tell you my story. And there's nothing they can do, with that. And it's biblical too. We overcome the enemy by the word of our testimony, right? So I think that's one of the main things I've learned is this generation finds truth speaking as discompassionate, as if you don't agree with me, you hate me. And so we have to be aware of that and disarm that. And my tagline is always compassion without compromise. We need to express deep compassion towards people and love them without compromising the truth. And so we have to figure out ways to package the truth in a way that people can hear it, so that that we don't build up unnecessary barriers there. So hopefully that helps. 5 more minutes. We can take 1 or 2 more questions. Is there anybody? I don't see any more questions in the thingamajiggy. Does anybody else have a question they want to ask? Amen. The gospel covers all of it. 1 more just popped into the box. You did? Oh, will you be making your dissertation publicly available? Yes. I'm working on getting that into a book format. So I have 2 books coming. One is just going to be like a book in like normal language for just the average layperson that wants to learn about these issues. It will have some of my testimony and a lot of the stuff from my dissertation, but just parsed down and made really accessible. Some of what I shared to you today was direct quotes in the scientific language of my dissertation, and it's a little kind of out there that I'm becoming more aware of as I'm sharing this. So there'll be 1 book, just kind of that way, kind of a trade book. And then there'll be another book that we're going to publish with an academic publisher that's reworking the dissertation in academic language with the hope that it can be used in Bible colleges and seminaries and things like that. So yeah, there'll be 2 books becoming available in the next couple of years. I appreciate your prayers for that. So anything else? Please let us know when your book is out. Oh, if you want to get a heads up on that, then you can go to my website and there's a link. You can sign up to get an email as soon as the book is published. Just a comment about the spiritual being manifested in my environment. Misogyny, hatred of women was a generational through both sides of my parents. It affected me greatly. Once this was made known and brought to the cross, I experienced great healing. This was a key stronghold in my desire to be male versus female. God created me to be. Amen to that. I resonate with that. I think a lot of times we don't take the spiritual side seriously. In your studies, you found anything related to the brain stem and amygdala? I don't have time to answer that quickly. What about the idea, this is just who I am, as if to say it's too hard or not realistic to change? I don't have a quick response. It does feel inborn. There's reasons for that. Oh, wow. So many questions. Is your dissertation on ProQuest now? Not yet. We are editing it. And so eventually that will be up on ProQuest. So you could buy it on ProQuest. Yes. Chemicals can affect our brain. Vaccines. Yep. Gender nonconformity with personality types. Yes. I'm an ISTJ, which is rare for women. So yes, that can play an effect in it as well. So I don't want to stall us to go. I think we have to go back to the main session. So I don't see a button to leave. No, nope, no going back. Well, we're not going back. So we are staying here. Go to break. Okay, we're going to a break. Oh, I didn't look at the schedule. Okay, so we are going to a break, and we are coming back at the bottom of the hour. So it is 3 p.m. Eastern time, so 3:30 Eastern time, or whatever time zone you're in. So great being with you guys. Bless you.